When honeybee workers leave a hive, they're going to collect one of four types of things: water for thermoregulation purposes, nectar to make honey. They're also collecting tree saps and rosins for propolis, but they also go after pollen. Bees collect pollen and bring it back to their nest because bees need pollen to make more bees. Pollen provides their protein, vitamin, lipid, mineral, nutrient source. So bees have to collect this in order to be able to create more bees in that colony. So in this particular video, I want to talk to you a little bit about what pollen deficiencies are, how to recognize them, and just a brief bit about how to deal with them. The first thing that you need to know is that pollen deficiencies can cause significant problems in colonies. As I've already said multiple times, bees need pollen to make more bees. And so what you'll see when there's a pollen dearth or a pollen deficiency, if there's not enough stored bee bread in the combs, bees will simply rear less brood. So let's talk about this. They collect pollen, they bring it back to the nest, they moisten it with nectar, it gets other bacteria and things that get mixed in with it, it gets put into the combs, and it grows over time to become this thing that we call bee bread. And they'll eat this bee bread. The worker bees will, specifically the young nurse worker bees. They'll eat that bee bread to develop brood food glands in their head. And with those brood food glands, the hypopharyngeal glands and the mandibular glands, they can produce the components of royal jelly or bee brood food or any of those things that they end up feeding the immature bees. So worker bees, young nurse worker bees, have to eat this bee bread to develop the glands necessary to produce the food to feed the developing larvae. That includes the queen, the drone, and the worker larvae. So that's one big demand for pollen. The second big demand for pollen is as those larvae age, specifically the worker and drone larvae, in the later days of food that they are given, they are having a little bit of pollen mixed into their diet by the worker bees that are feeding them. So let's think about that again. The nurse bees have to eat pollen to be able to produce the brood food in the first place. And they also mix pollen into the diet of latter day larvae that are getting close to undergoing that pupation step. So if you remove pollen from the system, the bees are going to continue trying to rear brood with the bee bread that they still have in the hive. Again, bee bread just being processed pollen. But if that ever runs out, then they'll simply be unable to rear brood. So how do you spot those deficiencies? Well, it's really simple. You get less and less and less brood being produced. If you have pollen coming into the hive, you've got bees that are able to produce more brood. But if you shut that down and bees use their stored bee bread resources, there will be no brood produced. One of the first signs that you're hitting a pollen deficiency is when you pick up the comb and you look into the cells that contain the youngest of larvae. Those larvae should be floating in a pool of brood food, this kind of white milky liquid that they're sitting in. Well, pollen deficiencies can produce what we call dry brood. There's these little larvae in the back of those cells, but they're not sitting in brood food. And what you'll see is the bees work really hard in pollen deficiencies to get the older brood to adulthood, oftentimes at the expense of the younger brood. In fact, these workers may go and cannibalize the younger brood because they have no pollen to feed them directly, or as well develop their glands to provide them brood food. So you get this cannibalizing of the young larvae, and then you get the cessation of brood production altogether. Now, the good news is pollen deficiencies are often seasonal and dictate the behavior of the colonies, what they should be doing anyway. So for example, in fall, when pollen is less and less available, colonies rear less and less brood, and then they get to the point where they're just carrying that cohort of adult bees through winter. And then of course, coming out of winter, going into early spring, there's a lot of pollen available, so the bees will use that pollen to grow their colonies really quickly as that pollen availability is peaking in mid to late spring. Then it starts to dwindle a little bit in summer, so the population will go down, and in fall it can go down further. So in most cases, these pollen deficiencies are timed seasonally to get the bees to do what they should be doing that time of year anyway. However, there may be times that you as a beekeeper want colonies to do something that they otherwise would not be doing, and that's where feeding pollen or feeding pollen supplements or substitutes come into play. We have a great video on feeding pollen substitutes. So when beekeepers, especially commercial beekeepers, are trying to get bee colonies to do things outside of the pollen season, they may provide pollen substitutes for them. That's not something I generally recommend for hobbyist beekeepers because usually you just need your colonies to match the season. But there may be times where you want them to do something that they're simply incapable of doing because there's not enough pollen coming in. Another great way to determine if you've got enough pollen coming in is you can stand at the entrance of the hive and see if bees are going in and out of the nest with pollen loads on their hind leg. And correspondingly, you can go into the hive and pull combs specifically in the brood area to see if you see pollen stored around the brood. If you don't see these things, and if you see dry brood, and if you see a cessation or reduction of brood rearing, then you know that you've got no pollen coming in or nutrient poor pollen coming in, and then you might take steps to remedy that if you're trying to get them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do that time of year.